if you see it.
It's loading. Oh, there we go. Now it's just have to put in presentation mode.
Okay, do you see it in presentation mode?
I can see your note, so I think you just have to change the display setting at the top. Or in that, you have three options at the top.
Okay, here. Let me know if it
There you
works.
go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Um, all right, well, thank you for that presentation. My title has become a little bit funner than initially. It was very long and boring, sorry. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys. I'm Elise Deschenes. I'm a forest biologist working under Isabelle Aubin at the Great Lakes Forestry Center. And we're going to be talking about 20 years of emerald ash borer research in Canada. So that's my big title to now. Um, so first and foremost, this project began around 15 years ago by Isabelle Aubin. And since it began, the team has changed quite a bit. And we wanted to take a second to recognize all the work of the amazing people that have participated in this project. And here we have a few, but they've changed over the years, and there are others that are not included here. And I'd also like to recognize that the work that we have been doing has taken place throughout much of southern and eastern Ontario, namely on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Algonquin, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga First Nations. So most of you probably already know what emerald ash borer is, I figure. But for those of you who don't, EAB, the short name for emerald ash borer, is a phloem and wood-boring beetle native to Eastern Asia that has killed millions of ash trees across North America since it was first detected in Windsor and Detroit in 2002. In Canada, now EAB can be found as far west as British Columbia, all the way east to Nova Scotia. And I've also included up here a figure of the distribution of green ash just to give you an idea of that range of expansion that EAB can have. And in North America, EAB can colonize healthy trees, infesting ash trees as small as 2.5 centimeters in diameter, so basically a loony, and killing most trees within 5 to 10 years of detection. So heavy regeneration from seeds and resprouting has been observed in many areas, but persistence of ash in our landscapes is quite uncertain and will really depend on whether these regenerating stems are able to reach a reproductive age. So if stems are not able to reach a reproductive age, it's highly likely that ash species will face functional extinction, where the species declines to the point where it can no longer play a significant role in its ecosystem. And so that was the case of American chestnut and chestnut blight back in the 1900s, where the blight would kill the trees before they produced seeds, which led to drastic declines. Now, due to resprouting ability, the species is still present once in a while, but only as a shrub, and it's unable to reach maturity and produce seeds. However, if EAB is able to reproduce and maintain viable populations, it'll be a situation more similar to elm and Dutch elm disease. So the disease mainly affects adult trees and takes up to 15 years to kill a tree, which allows enough time for seed production. And so now elm is still present in the landscape through succession of early maturing individuals and the persistence of a few large trees with some level of resistance to the pathogen. So a lot of uncertainty remains right now as to which of these two scenarios ash species will face, or which other scenario. And that's why Isabel decided to establish a network of long-term monitoring plots to really follow ash mortality across Canada and evaluate the ecological impacts of EAB and ultimately try and determine what the fate of ash would be. So here I've included a map of our long-term monitoring plot network that began in 2010. So back in 2010, 2012, the team installed 46 plots in my four green areas here. So plots were installed in white and green ash forests at the leading edge of the infestation. So only once EAB had been detected in an area, but before we'd seen complete mortality. And so we were able to follow this leading edge thanks to work by Krista Ryal, who was monitoring through traps the progression of EAB. But That being said, because we only started this work in 2010, in Essex County, the sites had already been dead since around 2004, 2006. So we were only able to install plots in 2010. And then we basically used different data from Landsat images to estimate the years of mortality. But in the other regions, we were able to install plots before significant mortality had begun. And so plots were installed in green and white ash forests in two urban areas, Oakville and Ottawa, and then two agricultural areas of Essex and Newbury, which is a large area that doesn't just encompass the small town of Newbury, and within two habitat types, so riparian areas and woodlots. We now have a portrait of up to 20 years after ash mortality in some of these older sites in the Essex County area. And these sites are kind of like our crystal balls, where we think that they can really give us insight into what we should expect in other regions of Canada as EAB continues its progression. And then in 2020 and 2023, plots were installed in black ash stands in more northern areas to follow the impacts of EAB on black ash forests. But for now, we don't have any results. So today I'm really going to be concentrating on the results in the white and green ash stands. As for the monitoring that was conducted during plot establishment in the early 2010s, the team conducted tree and vegetation inventories to get a portrait of the stands before significant mortality or before EAB portrait. Plots were then reassessed every couple of years to follow mortality. And once we considered that all the trees had died, or 90% of the trees had died, started conducting inventories again to get a portraits of stands after tree mortality. And now we have inventories in the range of 6 to 10 years after stand mortality and 17 to 20 years after stand mortality for the area of Essex County. After tree mortality, we also conducted some destructive sampling to get a better idea of infestation rates in some of those regenerating stems that we found. And so, as you can see here in this image, we well, I didn't, Laura Scott did, but scrape back the wood to count and age each individual gallery to really get an idea of how many times stems were infected and when they were infected. So for initial results, the main and biggest results that we found is that all mature ash trees died within 10 years of initial EAB infestations. We did not find a single mature tree that survived the course of the 20 years, and we initially counted around 1,130 trees within our study areas. In the Essex sites that were about 20 years after tree mortality, we found certain small stems that had been able to grow to a larger size over the years, but they were still only 13 centimeters large. And during the initial resurveys at the 6 to 10 year mark, we found dense ash regeneration across all regions, and same thing at the 17 to 20 year mark in Essex, still high regeneration. Here I've included some photos to show you what dense regeneration looks like. And this is one of the oldest sites that we consider that trees died around 2004. And at the 6 to 10 year mark in 2011, we can see that the canopy is quite open and stem densities could reach up to 10,000 stems per hectare. Whereas before EAB, it was around 500 stems per hectare. So there's very heavy regeneration. In 2021, at the 17 to 20 year mark, stem densities were still high, up to 5,000 stems per hectare, but they had decreased compared to 2011. We also found that stem densities of regenerating stems seemed higher in agricultural areas compared to urban centers. And this may be because urban centers had really variable regeneration patterns. So for example, we found that some sites had been invaded by buckthorn, which completely took over the understory and prevented any ash regeneration. In other sites, there was even removal of the dead ash trees, like here, and removal of invasive buckthorn, which led to complete loss of forest cover. And in this case, there really wasn't much to regenerate. In terms of the destructive sampling that was conducted, we found that 41% of regenerating stems that were assessed were infested at least once, and most of these stems still had a good vigor. 14% of stems were infested 5 or more times, and 2 stems even survived up to 12 infestations before we cut them. So they may have been able to survive even more, but we just simply don't know. And this led us to believe that young ash stems may be somewhat more resilient than mature trees to EAB because they were able to survive that initial outbreak that the trees did not survive. And they were able to survive multiple infestations over many years and still remain vigorous. But the question still remains, can they survive long enough to reach maturity and produce seeds? So we decided to create some timelines of the infestation because we were able to date the infections and the stems themselves. And here I've added the image. It's a bit complicated to understand, so don't try to read too much into it. But basically, we looked at when trees were born up until when they got infested to try to see, well, when did these infections happen? And we found that EAB generally had a preference for larger stems, which has been found in other studies as well. And EAB would only attack smaller stems after those mature trees had died. So once that basin of large trees was depleted, 98% of the infestations that we were able to count in the regenerating stems happened after tree mortality. And many of these regenerating stems were already present and large enough by the time the EAB arrived, although some of them would have been too small to be attacked. So we still aren't sure if these stems will be able to survive long enough to produce seeds. However, some of the stems that we cut were over 20 years old and around 7 to 8 centimeters DBH, which should be around the minimum size and age to reproduce, but we haven't found any seeds in our sites yet over the course of 20 years. So now we're kind of just waiting for a mashed year, but what complicates things further is that ash needs both female and male trees. So we still don't know yet if viable seeds can be produced. Interestingly, we also found much lower rates of infestation in urban centers. And so we wonder if this may be related to a lower carrying capacity in urban centers, where ash has been wiped out from these areas, and there simply aren't enough trees to sustain EAB populations. The greater regeneration in agricultural areas could be what is maintaining these higher levels, but this really requires further investigation. And I've also included here some photos of the parasitoid wasps that have been released throughout Canada and the United States that parasite on EAB larvae. And because interestingly enough, we were able to find some parasiting on EAB larvae. So this gives a little bit of hope that the parasitoids are doing their work. So to recap, we found that within 5 to 10 years of initial detection, all trees had died. We found strong regeneration, except in certain urban sites that were invaded by exotic species, and 41% of that regeneration had been infested at least once. Regenerating stems showed a certain level of tolerance to infestation, and some areas, namely urban areas, had quite low infestation rates. Thus, the hope is that in those areas where infestation rates are low, certain trees might be able to survive long enough to produce seeds, which would lead us to a situation similar to elm. In other regions where there's still continued EAB pressure, and the likelihood of an ash tree being able to survive long enough to produce seeds is really low. So ash will probably remain in the landscape due to resprouting, but it might be a situation similar to American chestnut. So we seem to be in a situation that is between elm and chestnut, and the exact scenario that ash will face still remains uncertain, and will depend on the complex interactions between ash regeneration and EAB population dynamics, and only the future can tell. So thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Isabel and myself. Isabel can answer questions in the chat today, or I can try, and you have our emails.
Thank you so much, Elise. That was a really great talk. We have a question in the Q&A box. I'll also give a chance for anybody who has questions right now. We've got a few minutes. Pop those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The first one we have is from Chris, who's asked, is ash regeneration from roots or seed bank?
So we can expect that initial regeneration in the first few years would be from the seed bank, but generally seeds in the seed bank won't last more than like 3 to 5 years. So after that, it would be regeneration from resprouting. And a lot of what we're seeing now that we're at the over 10-year mark is that it's mostly resprouting.
Okay, thank you. And I had a question. What does it mean when you say good vigor in a tree? Because my background's more aquatic, so I don't know what that means in the tree realm. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, I didn't want to get too into it because I thought it might be confusing. But vigor basically means the amount of canopy that a tree has. So if a tree has 100% canopy, it has a vigor, like a perfect vigor. If a tree, like in our case, good vigor would be that the trees still had about 75% of their canopy or more.
Okay.
So anything less than that would have been like moderate to bad vigor, but over 75% was good.
Okay, awesome. And I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So if anyone has any last minute thoughts that they think of, Elise's email will be available in the link that was just sent in the chat. So feel free to reach out to Elise if you have any follow-up questions. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.